Before phones had buttons, before you could dial a number yourself, every call in town began with a human voice, and for a few years of my young life, that voice was mine. The first job I ever had was sitting behind a wall of lights. I was 19, my hair pinned neatly under a little headset band, my fingers hovering over thick cords that smelled faintly of warm metal. The switchboards stretched wider than my arms could reach, a quiet forest of jacks and blinking bulbs. Each tiny light meant someone, somewhere, lifting a receiver. When the first light blinked, my trainer nodded. I plugged the cord in. "Number, please." My voice trembled a little that first day, though I tried to sound calm the way the older operators did. They moved like pianists, cords sliding between their fingers, plugs snapping cleanly into place. Lights flashed, cords crossed, voices murmured in steady rhythm. "Number, please. Number, please." By the end of the week, I could recognize people before they even finished speaking. Mr. Donnelly always cleared his throat first. Mrs. Alvarez spoke quickly, like she was afraid the line might disappear. And old Dr. Harper never remembered the numbers. He'd simply say, "Dear, get me the pharmacy." In a small town, you learned more than numbers. You learned voices, worries, the way someone sounded when news was good and when it wasn't. Once, late at night, a frightened boy whispered that his father couldn't wake up. My hands moved faster than my thoughts. Cord here, plug there, ring the doctor, ring the ambulance. When the line finally went quiet, I sat staring at the board, listening to my own heartbeat. The switchboard room had its own music. Dozens of women speaking softly, the tiny click of plugs, the constant blinking of lights asking for attention. We were invisible threads stitching the town together. Years later, the new machines arrived. Dial telephones, they called them. People could place their own calls now. No voice, no operator. One evening, I worked the board while a technician installed the first automatic switch in the back room. The lights blinked like always, but I could hear the future humming through the walls. I remember plugging in one last call. "Number, please," I said gently. The woman on the line laughed and said, "Oh, honey, pretty soon we won't need you girls anymore." I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. But what I didn't tell her was that the lights were still blinking in front of me. The lights were still blinking in front of me, patient and steady, as if they didn't yet know their time was running out. I kept working. "Number, please?" A farmer calling the grain office, a teenager asking for the movie theater, Mrs. Alvarez again, this time laughing so loudly I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. Outside the windows, the town carried on the way it always had, cars rolling slowly past the drugstore, the diner sign buzzing in the evening air. But inside the exchange room, something quiet was changing. Between calls, I could hear the new equipment humming behind the wall, a low mechanical sound, like a distant swarm of bees. One of the older operators, Margaret, leaned toward me and whispered, "That's the machine learning our job." She said it with a smile, but her hands moved a little slower on the cords. For weeks, the technicians came and went. They tested things late at night when the lines were quiet. Sometimes the board in front of us would go still for a moment, the lights dark, while they tried a call through the automatic system. The first time it happened, the silence felt strange. No blinking lights, no voices saying, "Number, please," just the faint ringing of a telephone somewhere far away. Then the lights came back, and we went on working like nothing had changed. But things did change. Operators who left weren't replaced. One switchboard closed, then another. The room that once held 50 women slowly grew quieter row by row. I remember the day Mrs. Alvarez called again. Her voice sounded confused. "Sweetheart," she said, "my phone just made this funny buzzing sound, and then it started ringing all by itself. Did I do something wrong?" I looked over at the technician standing by the new equipment. He gave a small nod. "The first dial call in town." "No, ma'am," I told her gently. "You didn't do anything wrong at all." I finished the call the usual way, plug, ring, confirm, and pulled the cord free. But after I set it down, I noticed something. One of the lights that normally would have blinked never did. The call had found its way without me. I sat there a moment, staring at the quiet jack, while the rest of the board continued flashing and chiming around it. Then another light blinked, and another. So I straightened my headset, reached for the cord again, and said, "Number, please?" The words came out the same as they always had, steady and polite, but something inside the room had shifted. You could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the rain arrives. The board still blinked, though not as often now. Some calls slipped past us completely, traveling through those new metal switches in the back room. The technicians called it progress. To us, it felt more like someone quietly dimming the lights one by one. Still, the people who needed us really needed us. One winter evening, a man's voice came through the line, shaking so badly I could barely understand him. "My wife, she's having the baby now." His words tumbled over each other. I didn't think. My hands just moved. Cord to the doctor's office, another to the hospital. Ring, confirm, connect. "Stay on the line," I told him softly. "Dr. Harper is coming." The lights blinked all around me while I kept that line open. I could hear the man pacing, hear the wind rattling the windows of his house through the receiver. Minutes later, another click came onto the line. Dr. Harper, calm as always. When I finally unplugged the cords, the board seemed brighter than usual, like every little bulb was breathing with relief. Moments like that were why we stayed. Machines could connect numbers, maybe, but they didn't know the sound of panic in a man's voice. They didn't know which doctor answered quickest at night. Years passed that way. Fewer operators, quieter shifts, more calls slipping through the automatic lines. One afternoon, the supervisor gathered the remaining girls around the board. There were only 8 of us left by then, sitting where dozens once had. She spoke gently, like someone explaining the end of a long story. "The last manual exchange will close next spring." Nobody cried right then. We all just looked at the board, at the cords hanging neatly in their places, at the rows of tiny lights that once filled the room like stars. After the meeting, I sat down for my shift anyway. The first light blinked. My hand reached for the cord almost out of habit. "Number, please." The voice on the other end hesitated a moment. Then the man chuckled softly and said, "You know, they told me I could dial this myself now." I smiled into the receiver. "Well," I said, glancing at the quiet rows of jacks around me, "since you called, you might as well tell me where you're trying to go." He chuckled on the line, but when the call ended and the cord slid back into its hook, the room felt quieter than before. That night, when my shift ended, I walked home the same way I always had, past the bakery that smelled like warm sugar, past the drugstore window glowing under a tired yellow light. The town looked peaceful, but my mind wasn't. Because the truth was, I needed that job. My father had passed the winter before, leaving my mother and 2 younger brothers behind. The small house we lived in didn't run on memories. It ran on rent, coal for the stove, and groceries that had to be paid for every week. My operator's paycheck, steady and modest, kept the kitchen warm and the lights on. Every morning I woke before sunrise. I'd heat oatmeal for my brothers, braid my hair in the mirror while the kettle whistled, and catch the early bus to the exchange building. Some days I arrived so tired my eyes burned, but the moment I sat behind the switchboard and the lights started blinking, something inside me straightened. People needed someone calm on the other end. Number, please. Those 2 words paid for school books. They bought my mother medicine. They fixed the loose roof shingle after a bad storm. But as the machines took over more calls, my hours slowly shrank. First, they cut the night shifts. Then they closed half the room. One Friday afternoon, the supervisor called me into her office. I already knew why. The desk drawer beside her held a neat stack of envelopes, final paychecks waiting like quiet goodbyes. She folded her hands and spoke kindly. "You've been one of our best operators." Best didn't stop the machines. Best didn't pay next month's rent. When I walked home that evening, the wind was sharp and cold. I remember stopping outside the house for a long moment, watching the warm yellow light through the kitchen window where my mother was cooking supper. I couldn't tell them yet. Instead, the next morning I went back to the exchange like nothing had changed. The room was half empty now. Only a few operators remained, their voices floating softly across the switchboards. The first light blinked. My fingers wrapped around the cord, the familiar weight of it steady in my hand. "Number, please," I said. The caller gave a number I'd connected 100 times before. While the line rang, I found myself staring at the board, at the fading rows of lights that had carried me through the hardest years of my life. And for a moment, I wondered what I would do when the very last one finally stopped blinking. The light kept blinking for a few seconds longer, waiting patiently. I finished the call the way I always had: plug, ring, confirm, and gently slip the cord back into its place. The board looked older now, almost tired, like it knew its long days were nearly over. That night, I finally told my family. My brothers were quiet. My mother stirred the soup slowly, thinking. For a moment, the kitchen felt heavy with worry, but then she looked up at me and smiled the same steady smile she had worn through every hard season of our lives. "You learned something important there," she said softly. "What's that?" I asked. "How to help people when they need you." The next morning, I walked to town again, not to the exchange this time, but to the small clinic near the train station. They were looking for someone to answer phones and greet patients. It wasn't the same work. There were no blinking lights or rows of cords, but there were voices, worried voices, tired voices, hopeful voices. And when the phone rang, I still answered it calmly, just like I had learned. "Good morning," I would say. "How can I help you?" Years passed. Machines kept changing the world just like they always do. Phones got smaller, faster, smarter. People began dialing numbers without thinking twice. But sometimes when my grandchildren ask about my first job, I tell them about the long switchboard room filled with lights and the women who quietly kept a whole town connected. I tell them about the night a frightened husband called for help, about Mrs. Alvarez laughing on the line, about the countless small moments where a steady voice mattered. And I tell them this: jobs may disappear, machines may take over, the world will always keep changing, but kindness, patience, and the willingness to help someone when their voice is shaking on the other end of the line, those things never become obsolete. Because technology can connect calls, but only people can truly connect hearts. And that is something no machine will ever replace. If this story reminded you of a time when people were a little more connected, go ahead and like and share it so others can remember it too.